Senator Munson.
Thank you, Speaker. And thank you to Senator Moody for bringing this whole debate up. It's long overdue. It's so important in our lives. And I was just thinking tonight, I was brought up in New Brunswick, northern New Brunswick, and in the 50s, you know, you're a child, at least I was, 57, 58, 12, 13 years of age, and you have all these heroes in your heart. We didn't have television in those days, but heroes in the National Hockey League. And it was interesting that people talk about Gordie Howe and Rocket Richard. But in New Brunswick, we had a hero, and it just came to me tonight in our 2-hour break, and I was thinking of Willie O'Ree. And I don't know how many senators here remember Willie O'Ree. Now that's a sports name. How can you not be in sports with a name like Willie O'Ree? Well, Willie was from Fredericton, and he was black. And who cares when you're a kid? He's a player who is in the National Hockey League. He makes it with one eye into the playing for the Boston Bruins in 1957, 1958. And he scores 2 goals, and he's good. He's a great hockey player. Then all of a sudden, he wasn't in the National Hockey League. He came back 4 years later. But he was considered at that time, and I want to have it on the record, he was considered the Jackie Robinson of the NHL because he made it. And my goodness, in terms of systemic racism and overt racism and in hockey rinks racism, primarily, as he said, in American cities and not so much in Montreal and Toronto, but it was a 6-team league. And he didn't get as much grief in Canadian centers, but in the boardrooms of the National Hockey League, Willie somehow didn't make it any longer after 2 seasons, and he scored goals. He played for the Quebec Aces, the same teams as Jean Beliveau played. But then Willie was gone. Today, at 84, Willie O'Ree is an ambassador for diversity in the National Hockey League. Today in the National Hockey League, there have been many stories of what happens in that. It's not maybe unconscious bias, but it's a bias where coaches have sometimes have suppressed the ideal of a black kid making it into the National Hockey League. Remember, that kid has to go through different levels all the way through from Pee-wee, Bantam, Junior, and on all his way up. And there have been some serious stories when I talked earlier today about arguing for this debate. I talked about the whole principle of what does take place, that you don't see it happening. Somehow Willie has persevered, and I hope that by just saying his voice tonight, that it echoes out there in the sports world again of what we have seen in terms of systemic racism, which began a long time ago. Everybody thinks they're doing well with a quota system or so. It's not about that. It's much more important than that. So why it came to me, but when you have an imagination as a child, when you have a name like Willie O'Ree, you didn't see black or white, you just saw a hockey player who should have played in the National Hockey League for 15 seasons. It didn't happen. Let's check our history. But I want to start off again by thanking Senator Moody for her leadership. And as she correctly points out, it's worth highlighting again, it is in the public interest that this discussion takes place. Canadians will continue to suffer if this is not given immediate attention. Racism is very intersectional in this country, and it's one of the reasons COVID has exposed the abundance of critical deficiencies in the way Canada operates. We are still waiting on complete statistics for the intensified effects of the pandemic in real time on racialized communities and loss of income, an increase of domestic abuse, and access to medical care. This is something we need to consider moving forward. There will be a need to continue action after COVID. It's clear that racialized Canadians are disproportionately affected during the pandemic, and many more lives have already been lost. Racism towards Afro-Canadians, Asian Canadians, and Indigenous Canadians has increased. Yes, COVID made things worse, but it's important to remind ourselves that inequalities were striking before the pandemic. Let's take a look at the data that we do have to develop solutions. Black Canadians are more likely than any other racialized group to be the victim of a hate crime. This is coming from data that has been reported by the police in 2018. Remember, this is only the crimes that were reported. It is also more often than not harmful for racialized groups to call the police. We've seen that. If you're unable, imagine what it would be like to be scared to call the police, just terrified to call the police, or it makes you uncomfortable to think about it. Then we're on the right track. We need to get into the realities of what is going on in this country. This is what Black people are dealing with every day, and they do not have the privilege of only imagining it. Honourable Senators, systemic racism intersects with gender, religion, age, disability, and even the labour market. Census data from 2016 reports the unemployment rate of Black Canadians is 12.5%, compared to 7.3% unemployment of non-visible minorities. This equates to thousands of jobs, high-paying jobs too. I would also point to the report last year in 2019, Canada's Color-Coded Income Inequality, released by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Severe gaps in employment and income remain in place. Honourable Senators, additional discrimination faced by racialized women also continues. Racialized women earn just 0.59 cents for every dollar non-racialized men did, while racialized men earned 0.78 cents compared to non-racialized men, according to this study. The example of racism in the labour market is one tip of the iceberg in the sea of racism that we have to address. And as I mentioned earlier, in support of this debate, what we are doing today in the chamber is a good place to start. We are only at the beginning of a solutions-based approach to systemic racism. We have lots of work to do. And I was always also just thinking, I know we're in this chamber, but there was something about the other chamber, the historic chamber in the center block, which I'll never get back to, but maybe some of you will, and I hope you do. And I hope you do listen to the echoes of senators in the long ago, and for me, not so long ago, who spoke about racism and yet weren't heard enough. And one is my conservative friend, Don Oliver. Don Oliver, another name to be thought of in the same vein in terms of politics as from New Brunswick, as from Nova Scotia, as Willie O'Ree is from New Brunswick. When you listen to Don Oliver in the chamber just across the way, talking about systemic racism, and in his reports and in his passionate discussion in the committees that I was on, when he talked about the public service in this country, and as he took on high-ranking public servants, take a look back at our history, our own history in this Senate of what Don Oliver said. It's important to read. He was fighting the good fight, and I felt sometimes he felt he must have been alone, very alone. Because as the picture of this chamber changes, and as we take a look at it, there is a picture of, I hope, more equality, but I want you to think back and perhaps take a look at what former Senator Don Oliver tried to do and attempted to do. And I think in that respect that we have to move on and keep fighting the good fight. In closing, earlier this week, the Parliamentary Black Caucus released a statement that goes into initial steps we're able to take right now, this minute. The government can take them. You can't put this thing off. I got very upset earlier this week about Indigenous Canadians and what is happening, and other minorities and what is happening. But when you stand up and see what has taken place in this country for a long time, we have a rich Black history. They are the fabric of this country, as Asian Canadians are the fabric of this country, as everybody else who has come to this country through the Underground Railroad. It is so important to remember our Black history. I don't even think we study it enough. We knew it in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia because it was there in front of us. At least it was at my dinner table growing up in Hamilton, New Brunswick. So in the statement by the Black Caucus, here are the steps they've talked about. And I'll just repeat them one more time so that they all sink in for us and for those who work with us. Make the collection of race-based data mandatory. Seek out and support proposals from Black business associations. Invest in programs that are rooted in the community-based initiatives. Ensure Black Canadians have equal opportunity to work in the public sector. Implement unconscious bias training programs throughout all government institutions. Honourable Senators, this is how we get the ball rolling on real change. And as Senators, we have a commitment to make Canada a better place, a safer place. Thank you.